His dying breath has brought me life. I know that it is finished.
Good evening. We're glad that you're tuning in to our evening worship. There are those that we want to keep in our prayers that are in the hospital or continue need of prayer. Margie England has been moved to Spire Rehab. She's asked for no visitors at this time. Tim Shoemaker will have a stent put in on June the 3rd. Also, Kay Carver's niece will be having surgery. We want to keep those folks in our prayers. Others we want to keep in our prayers are Jim Holcomb, George Shoemaker, Nancy Locklear, Donna Shoemaker, and Mike Godwin. We want to extend our sympathy to Angela Adams at the passing of her uncle, Marvin Hardy Jr. We also want to extend our sympathy to Alan and Margie England at the passing of their nephew, David Trammell. He lived in Florida. Other important announcements we have, you can pick up your communion on Saturday mornings from 8 to 10. You may also drop off your contribution at this time and pick up a bulletin. We still have Mass here, so you can pick those up when you come by on Saturday. Starting Sunday, May 31st, we'll begin having services at the building for Sunday morning worship. We also ask that you continue to fill out your survey and get those turned in as soon as possible. Also, we'd like to ask everyone to join us for a celebration of our 2020 seniors. On June the 6th from 8 to 10, we'll have a tent set up in the church parking lot with tables for our seniors. We ask that you drive through and wish them a happy graduation and a start on their future. And if you have any gifts at that time, you can drop it off at their table. That's all the announcements I have at this time. We'll turn the services over to Brother Jack Self.
Our first song is number 48, Anywhere with Jesus. Anywhere with Jesus I can safely go, anywhere he leads me in this world below. Anywhere without him dearest joys would fade. Anywhere with Jesus I am not afraid. Anywhere, anywhere, fear I cannot know. Anywhere with Jesus I can safely go. Anywhere with Jesus I am not alone. Other friends may fail me, he is still my own. Though his hand may lead me over dearest ways, anywhere with Jesus is a house of praise. Anywhere, anywhere, fear I cannot know. Anywhere with Jesus I can safely go. Anywhere with Jesus I can go to sleep. When the darkening shadows round about me creep, knowing I shall wake and never more to roam. Anywhere with Jesus will be home, sweet home. Anywhere, anywhere, fear I cannot know. Anywhere with Jesus I can safely go.
Well, good evening. As I mentioned this morning, this is part 2 to our lesson from this morning as we ask the question of what is my obligation as a Christian. We're going to be looking at Romans 15, verse 1, and Philippians 2, 3, and 4 to help us in our focus for that. In Romans 15 and verse 1, we're told that we who are strong have an obligation to bear with the infirmities of the weak and not to please ourselves. So that's where we get the title for our lesson from this morning and for tonight. Where do we get this concept of an obligation? What is my obligation as a Christian? But the other focus is going to be from the passage we've looked at for the last several weeks in our evening lessons. In Philippians chapter 2 and verse 3, it says, "Do nothing from rivalry or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others." So this morning, as we discussed what is my obligation, we looked at my obligation to obey God, my obligation to obey the governing authorities, and to balance the two. We wanted to start with that focus when it comes to relying on God. But we're ending with the focus of now what is my obligation as a Christian to my fellow Christians. In the fourth place, we find my obligation is to forgive. We're told to forgive one another as Christ forgave us. Matthew 18 and verse 21, you'll notice this is a lengthy reading, but it's lengthy, and it's important that we look at this, especially this is on the cusp of, right on the heels of an extremely powerful and challenging passage concerning forgiveness and how we go about it. There is a process delivered, handed down to us by Jesus that we will do well to pay attention to. And Jesus gives us a parable to describe it. I want us to go here before we go back up to 15 through 20. Verse 21 says, "Then Peter came up and said to him, 'Lord, how often will my brother sin against me, and I forgive him? As many as 7 times?'" So in fact, what he's asking is, should I go through the process that you just talked about 7 times? Jesus said to him, "I do not say to you 7 times, but 70 times 7. Therefore, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his servants. When he began to settle, one was brought to him who owed him 10,000 talents. That 10,000 talents. What it's saying here is there is no way that he could have ever repaid this in his entire life. Based on a daily wage, this would have taken 200,000 years to pay back. It is the concept of sin. It is the concept of a debt that we owe to God that no one could come up with enough to pay for that debt. Let's get our mind around that when it comes to sin. That's how serious sin is. Unforgiven sin in the sight of God. That's how serious it is. Verse 25, "And since he could not pay, his master ordered him to be sold with his wife and children and all that he had, and payment to be made. So the servant fell on his knees, imploring him, 'Have patience with me, and I will repay you everything.' Verse 27, "And out of pity, compassion for him, the master of that servant released him and forgave him the debt." An insurmountable debt received an insurmountable forgiveness. And so on the heels of Peter asking, "How many times should I forgive my brother? 7 times?" Well, Jesus is asking, how many times do you want God to forgive you? And do you realize just what God is willing to do in forgiving you? Do you realize the debt that you owe to God is insurmountable because of your sin, and yet He's willing to waive it? Well, then how should we treat our fellow Christians, our fellow man? Verse 26, "So the servant fell on his knees imploring, 'Have patience with me, and I will pay you everything.' And out of pity for him, the master of that servant released him and forgave him the debt. But when that same servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 days' wage." 100 denarii. This man owed 200,000 years according to the day's wage. But 100 days' wage was owed to him by this other servant. You would have immediately thought, you know what, I've just been forgiven an insurmountable debt. Go on your way. But look at the response. "And seizing him, he began to choke him, saying, 'Pay what you owe.' So his fellow servant fell down and pleaded with him, 'Have patience with me, and I will pay you.'" Wait a minute. Doesn't he remember? Shouldn't this have caused him to say, "Hey, I remember this taking place just a few moments ago. I did this before my master." So as verse 30, he refused and went and put him in prison until he should pay the debt. No concept of bankruptcy at this time. He's going to have to pay this debt, 100 days' wages. Verse 31, "When his fellow servants saw what he had done, they were greatly distressed, and they went and reported to their master all that had taken place. Then his master summoned him and said to him, 'You wicked servant, I forgave you all that debt because you pleaded with me. And should not you have had mercy on your fellow servant as I had mercy on you?' And in anger his master delivered him to the jailers until he should pay all his debt. That's an eternity of paying what was due. So also my heavenly Father will do to every one of you if you do not forgive your brother from your heart. We can forgive one another from words, but if we don't forgive from the heart, this is what Jesus is referring to. This is what Jesus is saying, and this has to do with my debt paid, forgiven, whether I'm going to forgive someone in this life. We've got to see that the two go hand in hand. In fact, I'd like to look at verse 15. If your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. If he listens to you, you have gained your brother. But so often we will not go to our brother. We'll go to someone else. We'll go to family. We'll go to a slew of other people before we go to our brother. Verse 16, but if he does not listen, take one or two others along. That's when we bring others in, when we've done all we can to go to our brother alone. If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. And if he refuses to listen even to the church, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. Truly I say to you, whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Again, I say to you, if two of you agree on earth about anything they ask, it will be done for them by my Father in heaven. For where two or three are gathered in my name, there am I among them. It's referring to conflict between a brother or between a sister. We go to that individual, and if they will not hear, that take two or three witnesses. The idea there is to not two or three witnesses to the crime, but two or three witnesses to the situation, to try to hear both sides, not ganging up. We see this as a perfect example of how we can hear both sides. Sometimes the person who had the initial issue will be the wrong person. That's when the two or three will be able to distinguish. You see, God, through Jesus, has established the right way to handle conflict. But when we go around what He has said, that's when devastation takes place. That's when the problems will not get better, but they will get worse. We have an obligation as Christians to forgive one another. Not just 7 times do we do this process, but 70 times 7. Jesus is not just giving 490 as this physical example. He's going as many times as it takes. Are you willing to do this for your brother? We would want Jesus and we would want God to do the same for our debt. That evens the playing field. So our obligation, if we're